On the west coast, right by the ocean, there's an entire ecosystem hiding beneath the rising and falling tides. Within the rock pools created from centuries of erosion lies a diverse, ever-changing collection of flora and fauna. With each changing tide, new animals are deposited in the tide pools, resulting in a constantly shifting environment. Given the harsh terrain, these animals and plants have adapted to fit their chaotic home. Tide pools are defined as rock pools that form into small pockets of water when the tide goes out. This cycle allows for plants and animals to become trapped in these pools until the tide returns. These creatures are subjected to sun, wind, storms, waves, and predators, meaning the chance of survival depends on how they have adapted to the situation. Much of the life in the pools has evolved to match these conditions. The tide pools are separated into two sections, the high tide zone and the low tide zone. The high tide zone is characterized by flooding while the tide is high. This covers the zone completely in water, allowing animals to return to the open ocean. During the period it is underwater, the zone is exposed to all the dangers of the ocean, including waves, currents, and sun. During low tide, the pools are filled with many creatures, mostly invertebrates, nudibranch, and other filter feeders. Seaweed is also present, making up a large part of the flora. This zone is especially fit for filter feeders, as the waves and currents bring in new food for them to eat. On the other end, the low tide zone is almost always underwater, with the exception of extremely low tides. The constant presence of water allows for greater biodiversity in both plants and animals. The water protects the creatures from drying out or becoming overheated. Protected from larger predators, the creatures can grow bigger than they would have done in the high tide zone. Plants flourish in the shallow water, as it allows for more photosynthesis to occur. Most of the flora in the tide pools consists of algae, a simplified plant consisting of a stem, known as a stipe, leaves, known as blades, and a holdfast, which substitutes roots. These plants float their blades up to the surface in order to photosynthesize. The three most common types of algae are separated into three phylums: chlorophyta, green algae, phaeophyta, brown algae, and rhodophyta, red algae. Green algae includes plants like sea lettuce, gutweed, and dead man's finger. Common rockweed, sea palm, giant kelp, and oarweed all fall into the brown algae phylum, while coralline algae and nori fall into the red. Each provide a habitat for many species living in the pools. The fauna in the tide pools are incredibly diverse and constantly changing to the rising and lowering tide. The most commonly seen phylums are cnidarians, mollusca, echinodermata, arthropoda, and others such as fish, birds, and marine animals. The most common instance of a creature in the cnidarian phylum are the sea anemones. Sea anemones are small creatures that don't look like much when the tide is low, appearing to be small green and brown lumps stuck to rocks, sometimes even covered in random detritus from the ocean. But when the tide is high, these creatures open up, revealing brightly colored, sticky tentacles. During low tide, these creatures close in on themselves to protect them from the sun, holding water in their bodies to keep them from drying out. They eat by capturing prey with their tentacles, which have stinging cells, called nematocysts. These cells have an anesthetizing venom that renders the prey helpless. The venom, however, is too weak to harm humans, so all the human would feel when touching an anemone is the stickiness of the tentacles. Even though it is harmless to humans, it is extremely dangerous to any small animals that come within its reach. The anemone can digest almost everything it eats, including mussels, crabs, and even some sea stars, spitting out the pieces they cannot digest. Not all sea stars are on the menu, however, since one of its main predators is the leather star, along with different species of nudibranch. The largest species of sea anemones are the giant green anemones. These can grow up to 10 inches and can live for up to 100 years. Another species are the aggregating anemones. While these are much smaller to their giant green counterpart, they make up for that by growing in large clusters, often completely covering the rocks they live on. This also means that, while large in numbers, they are more exposed to predators and sun. They combat this by sticking rocks, shells, and sand to its surface, providing both camouflage and another layer of sun protection. Aggregating anemones can live for almost 50 years and reproduce by splitting in half. Possibly the phylum with the most representation in the tide pools is Mollusca. This includes nudibranch, snails, limpets, chitons, and the occasional octopus. Nudibranch, also known as sea slugs, are small animals, most being about an inch long. They rarely live past 1 year, and are generally brightly colored to deter predators. They are voracious carnivores, eating anemones and sea sponges. They have 2 rhinophores at the front. They look almost like ears and are used to smell prey. These can be retracted into the body upon sensing danger. Chitons are also classified as mollusca. Chitons are small, flat, and jointed animals that cling onto rocks. They are covered in an 8-jointed, leathery covering, protecting them from most predators. Under the covering is a foot, used to stick to rocks and move the chiton around. They mostly move at night to avoid predators. They feed off algae by scraping it off the rocks. They accomplish this with their radulas, a file-like tongue. Their sizes differ for each species, with some growing up to the maximum of 2 inches, such as the lined chitons, and others growing up to 13 inches, like the gumboot chiton. The gumboot chiton can also live for up to 20 years. Their habitat also varies, with some being found more in the low tide zone and others in the high tide zone. Most chitons are black and brown, but the lined chiton can be red, pink, purple, yellow, and white. They are not affected by the sun, so do not need the same protection as other creatures in the tide pools do. Their main predator are ochre stars. Another animal in this phylum is the limpet. Limpets are small, shelled animals ranging from 1 to 4 inches long. Their shell is round with a definite apex. Like the chiton, it has a single foot, used for clinging and crawling. Over a period of time, the limpet's shell will scrape away a little hole in the rock. This creates a seal, which they use to hold water during low tides. They feed by scraping algae off rocks with their radula. Limpets move around mostly at night, and can travel up to 36 inches each night. To return to their specially made hole, they follow their mucus trail home. Snails are fairly common in tide pools. They can either be herbivores or carnivores, with different species having different diets. Herbivores tend to have round shells, while carnivores have horizontal spiral shells. To live in the ocean, these animals have gills instead of lungs. Much like the chiton and limpet, snails have radulas that can be used to scrape algae off rocks or drill holes into shells. Their own shells have an operculum, a small door-like structure in the opening of its shell. This seals water within the shell, keeping them from drying out. Snails hunt during high tide and stay in rock pools and cracks during low tide. Mussels are also a part of the mollusca phylum. These filter feeders come together to form beds. They stick to the rock using an adhesive liquid that solidifies upon contact with water, allowing them to stick firmly to the rock. Mussels feed on plankton and other microscopic animals. They provide shelter and protection for many other marine creatures. The phylum Echidnodermata contains many common sea creatures. This includes sea stars and sea urchins. Sea stars, along with anemones and urchins, are one of the staple tide pool animals. They generally have 5 arms, but some species, like the sunflower star or the morning sun star, can have over 15 arms. Each of these arms hold the sea star's vital organs, allowing the star to regrow its arms and sometimes even regenerate completely from a single arm. Sea stars move by crawling around with tiny tube feet on the bottom of their arms. They are hunters and use their arms to move food closer to their mouths before ejecting its stomach and secreting an enzyme that digests the prey. Sea stars have faced extreme death tolls over the years due to a reoccurring disease. Sea urchins are also a part of this phylum. They are small, round creatures completely covered in sharp spines. Sea urchins are omnivores, feeding both on plant matter and on the decomposing flesh from fish and other animals. They have a 5-toothed mouth on the underside of their body, and much like the sea star, move around using little tube feet. Like the limpet, the purple sea urchin uses its spines to scrape away rock, creating a hole to stay in. Other animals also stay in the hole, sitting underneath the urchin. Both urchins and other small animals use these holes as protection from harsh waves. Several arthropod species make their homes in tide pools. Crabs are a common sight in most, whether they are hermit crabs or rock crabs. Crabs either have a hard exoskeleton or use discarded shells from other animals as protection. Most crabs are omnivores, eating both algae and scavenging dead animals. The name rock crab covers several different species. However, they all share the same basic characteristics. They have a hard exoskeleton and very good eyesight. The exoskeleton retains water, keeping the crab cool while on land. While their exoskeleton provides good protection, they eventually outgrow it. This means they will have to molt. The crabs crack the back of the shell and simply crawl out. At this time, their new shell hasn't hardened yet, so they are extremely vulnerable to predators. Most rock crabs can grow up to several inches. Hermit crabs, on the other hand, do not grow their own shells. They use other animals' discarded shells as protection from predators. This is a quicker process, as all they need to do is find a worthy shell and slip out of the old one and into the new. This process takes only a couple seconds, so it's much safer than molting. However, fights sometimes break out over shells, leading to injury. Barnacles are also arthropods. They appear as small lumps on a rock, always closed when the tide is low. However, when the tide is high, the small doors on it open, and feathery legs extend out, waiting to catch plankton. The barnacle is extremely strong, protecting itself against most predators. They will attach themselves to almost anything, even other animals. Other animals are known to show up in the tide pools. Birds, such as gulls, oyster catchers, and shorebirds, are a common sight, many of them feasting on the exposed wildlife. Marine mammals are also sometimes found near the pools, with seals and sea lions being the most frequent visitors. Unfortunately, these ecosystems are in danger. As with many other fragile habitats, the tide pools are negatively affected by human interaction. Pollution, global warming, and the introduction of invasive species threaten to damage many of these areas. Some of the most widespread events in the tide pools are the mass outbreaks of sea star wasting syndrome. These epidemics occurred in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, but by far the most devastating outbreak was in 2013 to 2014. This disease results in extremely high numbers of sea star deaths, calculated to be around an 81% fatality rate. The most affected areas included Alaska, California, Oregon, and Mexico. Symptoms included behavioral changes and lesions appearing on the skin of the animal. The sea stars also suffered from a loss of turgor, limb autonomy, and death, caused by rapid cell degradation. In short, the sea stars would begin to melt. While no definite answers have been put forward to explain the outbreaks, there are several theories that hold some merit. The most widely accepted theory is that the sea stars are affected by the densovirus, a single-stranded DNA virus. Other theories blame global warming and pollution. Connections to the 2011 Fukushima nuclear disaster had been theorized, but subsequent investigations found no solid evidence to show any connection. Luckily for the sea star population, many have been seen to have evolved to protect themselves from the virus, becoming immune to the deadly disease. Although sea star wasting syndrome is not conclusively linked to human interaction, that does not spare the other animals living in the pools. The increasing water temperatures caused by global warming results in a chain reaction of negative events. As the water heats, animals migrate to cooler temperatures, introducing invasive species to other ecosystems. For example, invasive sea slugs move north in an attempt to find colder water. This harms the local nudibranch populations. Studies show that the ocean's temperature has increased by about 1.5 degrees in the past 50 years. The changing temperature also harms the plant life in the tide pools. Weedy seaweed has decreased, while turf plants have been increasing. The rising sea levels affect the delicate balance of the tidal zones. Increased carbon dioxide absorption causes the oceans to acidify. This causes animals to grow thicker shells to combat this. The thicker shells make it almost impossible for predators to access their prey, leaving them to starve. The thicker shells also affect the animal negatively, forcing them to use all of their energy on simply carrying the shell in the first place. On the other end of the spectrum, the shells of oysters, clams, and mussels dissolve, leaving them vulnerable to predators. Hermit crabs are also affected by this, their shells too weak to protect them. Clam shells reveal decreased calcification, making their shells easily breakable. Crabs benefit from the weaker shells in the short term, easily feeding on the clams. However, in the long term, the clams are unable to maintain their populations, quickly disappearing from the tide pools. The tide pools are a beautiful, up-close look at the ocean and the animals that inhabit it. The cycle of the tide allows for a constantly changing ecosystem filled with amazingly diverse creatures. The danger the pools are in prove the point that the climate is in danger. If the Earth's temperature continues to rise, the tide pools could be destroyed, the animals and plants that once inhabited it disappearing forever. Until then, tide pools will remain as one of the most interesting ecosystems on the planet.